Hi there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going back to cover yet another album, the self-titled debut album from Run the Jewels. Okay, so it's time for me to talk about a fundamental tenet of my reviewing philosophy. Whenever I go into an album, I always try to discern the artist's intent and then try to review the album that they built with that sort of intent in mind. It's all a matter of how well they present and deliver that intention and their message and how they control their scope. And this can mean that some acts will get good reviews from me despite the fact that they aren't really aiming to make anything all that deep or transcendental. Thus, if a boy band makes an album full of silly dance and love songs, for example, that's the standard by how you should review them. You shouldn't expect them to make any sort of grand positing statement about the human condition. And as much as you'd like to rage and complain that they aren't making these grand, affirming, meaningful statements, they aren't trying to do that. Now, for an example, compare the original review of Andrew WK's I Get Wet by Pitchfork, and then look at the re-review a decade later and you see a bit of a change in perspective from that angle. But at the same time, this sort of reviewing philosophy can get rather frustrating when approaching albums that can attain some measure of critical acclaim about 6 months too late. Which takes us directly to the self-titled debut album from hip-hop duo Run the Jewels. Now this duo is composed of two important names in underground hip-hop, Atlanta rapper Killer Mike and near-legendary Brooklyn rapper-producer LP, the latter of which has been a favorite producer of mine in the underground for quite some time. Now in 2012 they collaborated on a pretty damn solid album titled Rap Music, with Killer Mike on vocals and LP handling production, but this year LP decided to step up to the mic himself for their newest project, Run the Jewels. Now to be completely honest, I didn't cover this album until now because, hey, I can't cover every single hip-hop album and mixtape that hits the shelves. I'd be swamped. But given the critical attention and acclaim that it has received, I figured, well, I need to cover it sometime. And unfortunately, it's taken me almost half a year to get through my backlog to get to it. And believe me, considering how well this album was received, I was seriously pumped for something special from two serious heavyweights of the genre. Did I manage to get that? Well, in a way I did. Let's get this out of the way. Run the Jewels is unquestionably an extremely good album and one of the best hip-hop releases of this year. Hell, one of the best album releases of this year, and I'd be lying if I didn't say that I liked it a great deal. It's the kind of bombastic, high-energy, hyper-intense album that we don't see enough of in hip-hop, especially this year, and it's smart enough to know exactly what it is and how to achieve its goals. And yet, while I do think it's extremely strong, I don't quite love it, or find it nearly as enthralling as several definitely worse albums released this year, which is intriguing in its own sort of way. Let's just say this, it accomplishes everything that it needs to do, but thus, on that note, it's not quite as interesting as some notably flawed albums that opt for higher ambitions. Now, let's start with instrumentation and production, which fuses these dark and snarled beats with futuristic synths and heavy 808s into a cacophonous mix that still manages to sound quite coherent. If I'm going to use an adjective to describe this album, it would be dense, because of the thick mixture of grimy, twisted beats and melodies is fused together into a complex and compelling mixture that still manages to keep the focus centered on the two rappers in question. At points, I'd argue that the synth mix is a little bit too dense. Perhaps fewer sound effects could have achieved the same result, but it never reaches the point of actively grating or even sounding overproduced. A slightly bigger problem, though, is that I never found the hooks all that incredible. Sure, songs like Sea Legs and Get It and the title track had very memorable and recognizable hooks that I really liked, but the hooks were never the focus driving the momentum on the songs and on the album as a whole, and that really does show. Now, granted, that's not exactly a bad thing, because the momentum is primarily driven by the hard and fast flows of LP and Killer Mike, two rappers at the absolute top of their game on this album. Killer Mike has always been a ferocious rapper with a ton of energy, but he modulates well and brings some compelling and complex wordplay to match LP, who has a reputation for deeper rap, more driven by symbolism and non sequiturs, which he delivers quite well with punchlines and wordplay that you rarely see in this medium. And the interplay between these two rappers is easily one of the big highlights of the album, because they bounce off each other incredibly well, with a lot of chemistry and confidence to work extremely effectively together. It's almost to the point where other artists feel a bit out of place on the album at all. And while Big Boy definitely justifies his presence with a great closing verse on Banana Clip, Prince Paul and Until the Ribbon Breaks, they don't quite fit with the mix in the same way. Don't get me wrong, they're still decent, but they're not quite as strong in the same vein. They just feel slightly out of place. But really, the reason that you came to this album are for the lyrics and are for the punchlines. And here, well, Look, it's damn near perfect. Killer Mike's more forceful delivery bellies his more direct style of attack, and while LP goes for a subtle route that can often prove just as cutting, if not more so, if only through surprise and shockingly clever wordplay. And indeed, that's pretty much what this album is. Two master wordsmiths going all out with bragging, insults, and subtle jibes, and not a lot beyond that. Now, there are a few songs that venture slightly outside of this formula. No Come Down opts to show how both rappers act when they're high on some form of drug. Sea Legs asserts how they've remained stable and controlled against the rising tides of the industry, throwing in disses against Kanye West and Jay-Z for good measure. And A Christmas Fucking Miracle is a more serious track that speaks out against the music industry, the prejudices of the government, and other forces that would opt to coerce and subvert them as rappers. The latter two tracks really do a lot to add a lot of nuance and pathos to their message, with a lot of real emotion anchoring them and driving things forward. And they show that LP and Killer Mike really wanted to temper their brag raps with actual substance, that they could and actually do really pull it off. Because here's the thing with this album. It's essentially a load of hard-hitting brag raps and diss tracks that have just enough cohesion and serious effort to elevate them just above a simple mixtape. And really, that's all it's trying to be, keeping a lighter, mischievous tone to not seem so much dark or imposing. They don't need to rely upon sinister imagery or scare tactics when sheer, pure, unbridled wordplay will do the trick for them. However, combined with the extremely quick runtime of this album that barely stretches over a half hour, it can make Run the Jewels feel a little bit lightweight and lacking in true dramatic heft to really stick with me, as they could have done something with a little more import and potency, and they instead chose to do this instead. It feels a bit like a major leaguer stepping up to a t-ball bat. But then again, when the wordplay is as good as it is, and the more serious tracks are as strong as they are, I can't exactly argue that they executed their intent damn near perfectly. With the scope that they chose, Run the Jewels was able to accomplish exactly what they wanted. But at the same time, I'm left wishing that they had aimed just a little bit higher for something with a little bit more ambitious subject matter, as I'm certain they could have pulled it off. As it is, it's really, really strong, but not quite transcendental. So in the end, I really did like the self-titled debut from Run the Jewels, but I'm not quite sure it's the album that would really stick with me in the long term. I'll admit, I'm a sucker for music with a heftier message than pure unbridled bravado, but I won't deny that LP and Killer Mike made something that they weren't really hunting for that. And on that level, on the level of brag raps and sheer unbridled potency, they knocked this album out of the park, so it unquestionably earns its 9 out of 10. The production instrumentation is damn near top of the line, and where it falters, the rapping picks up the slack. If you're a fan of hip-hop in any variety, well, you've probably already picked up this album, but if you haven't, you definitely should get Run the Jewels. Hip-hop needs more guys like these, and if you're looking for rappers to raise the stakes, I couldn't think of a stronger act. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums you'd like me to take a look at before the end of the year, I'd be more than happy to take a listen. Until then, see you next time.